Hello everyone, and today we have a special guest, Bismarck from Military Aviation History.
Hello everybody.
And we will talk about the differences between the Eastern and Western Front in terms of air warfare in the Second World War. So at first we need to look at the general differences. So we begin basically in 1941 to 1945 for the Eastern Front, and for the Western Front we focus mainly on 1944 to 1945. And one major difference is basically the terrain, because the Eastern Front was way wider and bigger, so we have different approaches on how to deal with the issue, whereas the Western Front was rather small in comparison. So these resulted in various differences, and I think Bismarck knows more on this. What is your take on this?
All right, so when we look at the Western Front, what we see throughout the war is essentially a strategic operation. We have these brief moments of tactical combat where the air forces, the Luftwaffe particularly, is used in a tactical domain. What comes to mind here is, of course, the Battle of France and later on also, in a sense, the Battle of Britain. However, that kind of dies down relatively quickly. By 1940, we don't really have that many tactical strikes anymore on the Western Front, and it really becomes a battle of sending bomber formations into enemy territory, trying to destroy industry, harbors, ground installations, or indeed targeting cities. This starts to escalate as the war goes on into 1941, 1942, 1943, and so on, until we arrive at the point that we're going to look at, and that's 1944 and 1945, where, of course, we all have these mental image in our head, these huge bomber formations, Allied bomber formation coming in day and night, trying to destroy German industry in German cities. And except for some brief moments, the Luftwaffe really doesn't have an answer, a strategic answer to that. There is a sort of resurgence of bomber operations over Britain by the Germans in the mid-war period. That doesn't amount to much, also because the Germans are targeting the wrong targets. But overall, it very quickly in the West becomes a battle of fighters, that is German fighters, versus Allied bombers. It is not so much a fighter on fighter trying to wrestle away air superiority. That is, of course, an integral part of it as well. Should be mentioned as well. But for the Germans, what is really important in the late war period is shooting down bombers. On the whole, whenever 109s or 190s go up into the air and try to intercept B-17s, B-24s, they really just focus on the bombers. They tangle a little bit with the escorts, and they don't do much more with them, but they really go for the bombers and try to shoot those guys down, because they know that's what destroys our own industry. And they also know that when they shoot down a single bomber, the damage inflicted is way greater than even if they shot down 2 or 3 fighters. So that's, in essence, kind of I wouldn't really call it an attritional war, but it's a very specific kind of fight where this kind of image that we have of tactical strikes and so on doesn't really fit in. Now, on the Eastern Front, this is obviously completely different. In the Eastern Front, for one thing, we have very little strategic strikes overall. The Germans sometimes fly to Gorky, for example, to the factories over there. That's beyond Moscow, to the east of Moscow. And they bomb Moscow a little bit early on, but very quickly those kind of missions are abandoned, and their medium bombers, so the Ju-88s and the Heinkel 111s, are more and more used in a tactical role as well. And of course, the Russians, with their IL-2s and with their Peshkas and you name it, focus very heavily on tactical strikes.
Yeah, from what I read is that Stalin from the Spanish Civil War drew the lesson that basically strategic bombing is too inaccurate. And so there was a major focus on tactical close air support. This is why the IL-2 was then developed. And additionally, what a main difference is on the Eastern Front, basically both the Luftwaffe and Red Army Air Force focus on supporting ground operations. They basically become vehicles for the armies or flying artillery in a sense. Whereas on the Western Front, the Air Forces act way more independently, although we should note that the US Army Air Force was still an Army Air Force. But the whole difference is visible in that part. This is also why on the Eastern Front, it's usually focused on local air superiority, which is quite in contrast to the Western Front, because in the Western Front, in the final year of the war, basically in 1944, 1945, there's complete, basically, air supremacy by the Western Allies, and the army can only move during the night usually. Everything else would just get shot down by interdiction strikes. Whereas on even 1945, the German army can march on the Eastern Front during daylight because there's less focus on interdiction and way more focus on close air support.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm just going to go over those points again. So with Stalin, what Stalin with the Red Army, or essentially the Soviets took away from the Spanish War, is quite interesting. In the 1930s, there was, in fact, a rather vibrant aviation scene in the Soviet Union, and this is in fact something that is in many countries going on at the moment. But specifically with the Russians, they come up with all sorts of designs and all sorts of planes, and they go into the war in 1941 when Operation Barbarossa happens. They go into the war with near a circus-like variety of aircraft. They have some strategic bombers who, in fact, very early on also make an attack on Berlin. It's kind of act of defiance, you could say, just like the Doolittle raid was when the Americans launched that against Tokyo. And they also have close air support aircraft. They also have tactical bombers. They have naval bombers. They have everything. The problem is they have a little bit too much, and not everything is exactly great. So later on and throughout the war, they really realized the importance of tactical strikes. And as you said, on the Eastern Front, the Russians specifically focus on the frontline combat. Yeah, I believe there is this kind of approximate estimate that was given once, is that between 80 to 90% of Red Air Force activity was within 10 kilometers of the front lines. So they never really went in, as you said, in interdiction strikes, trying to hit something behind the front lines. That did happen occasionally, but not very often. And this also allows, of course, the Germans then to maneuver behind the front lines and send troops from A to B. In the West, that doesn't really happen, just like you said. The Germans are very dependent on the weather situation. We see this in the Ardennes offensive, where they initially have quite a lot of success. Then the weather clears and the Allied Air Force comes into play. And even though all those ground attackers, the kills that these attacks supposedly did on the Panzers are vastly exaggerated. But what it does create is kind of this essence of, if we move during the day, they're going to attack us and we are going to suffer losses or damaged equipment and so on. So let's just move at night. And obviously that brings with it a lot of complications. Now with the topic of local air superiority, this is where it gets really interesting, in my opinion. On the whole, the numerical superiority that the Allies have in the West is staggering, especially by mid to late 1944. The Germans, even if they try to pool all their assets within one area, they're not going to be close to the amount of fighters that the Allies have in that area. It's just not possible. That is why they kind of focus on these quick attacks on these bomber formations, get in, shoot a bomber down, shoot a second bomber down, get out, and so forth. But when it comes to tactical air, that's absolutely impossible. On the Eastern Front, however, the Germans, even though there is also this air superiority that the Russians have, the front lines are so vast that even though the Soviets have so many pilots and so many planes, the Germans are able to wrestle away air superiority once in a while, local air superiority once in a while. I think the best example is, I believe, during the Battle of Kursk, where the Germans did establish local air superiority at some points in time. And this, you might say, oh, this sounds good, a couple of days, local air superiority. No. We're talking about a couple of hours. They go in They defeat, all the elements that are there from the Russian Soviet Air Force. They intercept IL-2s coming in and so on, and they establish local air superiority, allowing their ground elements to advance or to retreat, whatever is necessary at the point, and then they bug out. And the battle, of course, is probably the last real example of the German Luftwaffe being able to do so in the Eastern Front. But you do have these moments in time where there's, just for a couple of minutes or even for a couple of hours, they do establish local air superiority in some areas, but it's very, very difficult.
I read that there's this main difference that, for instance, the Soviets and also the Germans to a certain degree, they saw air superiority not for the sake of air superiority itself or fighter battle for the fighter battle itself, but only to establish a ground attack, to support ground forces or something. That it's not for the sake of it. It's a different approach also. Can you confirm this?
In the way it played out, that's very much true. Yes. It should also be said that when you look at air superiority in the defense of the Reich, the Germans never have the chance of actually establishing it after these long-range kind of escorts come in. So for them, there is no thinking of, we have to try to secure our airspace against the Allies, because there was perhaps this chance they could have done it if they hadn't wasted all their planes on Operation Bodenplatte. At that point, perhaps they could have wrestled away, at least contested air superiority, Allied air superiority in the West. But it would have been quite a significant struggle, in my opinion. In the East, the way it played out is very much like you said. And, what good is it having planes in the air at a certain point when there's nothing going on there and, keeping the superiority at that when, in fact, they are needed somewhere else. And this is also why on the Eastern Front, we see a lot of Jagdgeschwaders specifically hopping from airfield to airfield, and they often change, within a matter of weeks or sometimes even days of where they're based because of where they're needed most. Yeah, the Russians launch an offensive somewhere and attack. Okay, well, the Jagdgeschwader has to redeploy, let's say 200 kilometers to the north. And 2 weeks later, there's a German attack going on at this specific town. Well, now the Jagdgeschwader has to fly back south, 300 kilometers back south, and act there. So this kind of airfield hopping that we see in the East all the time doesn't happen in the West as well.
Yeah, I noticed one author notes this major difference. You can have a continuous dispersion of your troops like it was on the Western Front for the Allies, where basically everything is covered and you have a limited amount of troops everywhere, or planes in this case. And on the Eastern Front there was always the Soviets mass their attacks. So on the periphery or on the secondary parts where they don't had anything, they pulled out their units, and they were very good at disguising pulling out those units, which is to a certain kind related to Maskirovka, and then mass their units where it was crucial when they did attack or before an attack. And this was basically, you have a continuous dominance in the West, and you have this concentrated, basically you could say burst attacks or burst dominance on the Eastern Front, because you have a way bigger territory. And additionally to that, what you mentioned before with the 10 kilometers, I read the same, and it was basically, from what I read, established in 1941 because the Soviets realized the Luftwaffe was too strong, and when they flew only about 10 kilometers, they could always basically retreat. They flew away, and then they would fly into to the anti-aircraft defenses usually, and also in some cases could trap or lead the Luftwaffe into an air defense trap. And this only changed, I think, around 1943, when there was basically a kind of equality in terms of doctrine, tactics, and technology arrived on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, 1943 is kind of the big year, especially with the defeat at Stalingrad, even though it's obviously a ground battle. But that's kind of often considered as the turning point, of course. But by 1943, the Soviet Air Force had largely recovered. They weren't just quite there yet, but they were able to comfortably wrestle with the Luftwaffe. They were able to establish air superiority, local air superiority, in quite a few parts of the Eastern Front when they wanted to. They had enough material. They started to have enough pilots as well to replace losses that were being suffered. And also their equipment was vastly improved. In 1941, we all know the stories, Soviet equipment, it's outdated, it's bad, it doesn't work. There's a lot of truth to that. On the one hand side, a lot of their equipment is in fact outdated. On the other side, their modern designs that are coming out are being rushed into combat with no proper production quality. So I think I read a Soviet account where they literally admitted the specific Geschwader that they got lag freeze. And they said about a third of the lag freeze we got in 1941, 1942 were not usable because they were just shoddily built. And sometimes, you would even like hear screws just like banging inside the wings because they weren't properly fastened. They had gotten loose. And that's kind of the build quality they had at this point. By 1943, this is changing tremendously. The Russian air, they don't have the same production standards as in the West or that Germany does, but it's good enough and it starts to work. And also the designs they come out with the LA5. Yes, initially the LA5 does have some problems, but by the time that the LA5F and the LA5FN comes out, they have really a plane that for the purposes that they need is excellent. And that is, of course, establishing local air superiority, tangle with the Luftwaffe, protect the ground attackers, and all of that at low altitudes. Yeah, so we're talking about 2,000 meters or below. Some of the combat still goes up to 4,000 meters. That is roughly 14 or 15,000 feet for Imperials out there. But usually it's around 2,000 meters, which is roughly 6,000, 7,000 feet.
About the introduction of new equipment, I read that they also employed Maskirovka in this case, and that, for instance, the Soviets delayed the introduction of many fighter planes for quite some time and then introduced them in mass. Sadly, I couldn't find any more. Do you know more about this?
I'd actually have to check myself. That's an interesting kind of idea, and it would be worth looking at what time frame that would be, because I'd have problems believing that it was like this in 1941 or 1942 or even 1943. Maybe later on I could, yeah, it would be possible that certain fighter wings were equipped with new aircraft. They were kept in reserve for some time, and then for one specific operation, they were all rushed to the front lines, and they have new fighters. And so on. This would actually be something worth looking into. I'm not quite sure on it.
I looked it up here again. There sadly is no information on the time frame. It notes, as far as the Soviet Air Forces was concerned, one very important way to implement Maskirovka consisted of choosing the right moment for introducing new weapons. To delay the deployment of advanced aircraft always implies a certain cautiousness. It means that active units have to make to do as best they can with existing types, even though they may already be obsolete. Sadly, there's no more further information.
Considering what we read about Soviet aviation, and I don't mean just from Western sources, but also from Soviet sources, the equipment they got 1941, 1942, and even 1943 is in some ways shoddy build quality. So in trying to say like, oh yeah, we kept our fighters back because we wanted to bring them all in at once and so on, I find that hard to believe at this stage. Later on, that's definitely possible. Maybe it would be interesting to look at some of the later fighter planes that they have, but actually that's more or less the first time I hear about this.
Okay, that's very interesting. So also, you don't have any accounts of the Luftwaffe just being surprised that a lot of new fighter planes showed up or something else?
Well, pilots were surprised all the time. I mean, the one thing that just comes up to my mind now is when the Soviets got Spitfires. The Germans were completely surprised, but that's understandable because obviously, who expects a Spitfire on the Eastern Front? But for example, if you go with let's say the Yaks, right? You have a Yak 1, you have a Yak 7, and suddenly the Yak 3 comes out. The differences between the airframe, they exist, not that obvious initially. So the way the Germans realized it, in a sense, is when they shot something down and they looked at it, it's like, oh, this is new. Or when they tangled with it and they realized, hey, that thing can pull maneuvers the other one couldn't. And then they realize, oh, okay, they have new fighter plane. There is some reconnaissance and some intelligence at play, of course, when they hear, okay, well, the Russians or the Soviets are working on a certain thing at the moment. We don't know when they're going to bring it in, but they will eventually. I'm not quite sure how much of that information was shared with the frontline pilots, to be honest. I don't think there would have been a lot of intelligence sharing up until the point when it was necessary.
Another interesting point, what I read, was basically that due to the strong focus on the Eastern Front on tactical aviation and also used in an operational sense, that the Soviet Air Force, to a large degree, I mean, it like strategic bombers and also reconnaissance planes and other elements for a long part. So basically, it's mainly focused on fighters and close air support, and also the ranges are lower, and also the payloads are quite different in terms of equipment.
Yeah, that's right. The Soviets do have some some planes that have the capability of acting in a strategic role, but not a lot of them. And the designs are, let's say, not the best. On paper, they look good. Some of them, in practice, but what they do really well is fighter designs, which the Soviet designs of fighters are actually pretty good. Nobody gives them credit for it. But they have some really, really stellar designs, especially once like I already said, the later LA-5s come in and the later Yak versions. They for what is needed on the Eastern Front, that is a low altitude, high performance fighter, absolutely excellent. The one thing that you haven't mentioned there is anti-shipping. And the Soviets do, especially in the Baltic, there is some contestation. I'm not sure if that's the word, but you get it. They do contest the control that the Axis have in the Baltic Sea, and they use, of course, for example, Peshkas, so P-2 naval bombers, or used in a naval role. And at that point, the Peshka is exactly sort of a really interesting kind of aircraft. It has a very good performance. It has a competitive bomb load, and it performs really well in the roles that the Soviets needed to perform, and that is anti-shipping, and in a way also a little bit of CAS involved in there. And the Germans, on the other hand, they of course have the Bf-110, and the Bf-110, after the kind of fiasco in the Battle of Britain on the Eastern Front, it starts making a name for itself again, and that is in a fighter bomber role. The Germans retrofit a lot of their fighter planes, the Bf-110 fighter layouts, let's say, with extra armor plating and so on, and put them into fighter bomber role, and it does really rather well on the Eastern Front there. Up until a point. Later on, 1943, 1944, the Bf-110s aren't really used in that role anymore. They are rather being pulled back to the defense of the Reich, especially as night fighters. But you can see that these planes have a very dedicated role, and they perform rather well. For the Germans, there's also a little bit of anti-shipping in the West, of course, which on the Eastern Front, up in the north, not just in the Baltic, but up in the north at Murmansk, there's, for example, JG5, Eismeerjäger, that's their nickname, and they are hitting shipping that goes into Murmansk and comes out of Murmansk. And what is interesting about this Geschwader, this happens once in a while during the war, but they also have, for example, a dedicated Zerstörerstaffel with them. So it's a normal fighter wing, but attached to them there's kind of this auxiliary Bf-110 Staffel, and they are also used in an anti-shipping role. So there's a lot of flexibility, let's say, on the Eastern Front in the way that Yak Geschwaders are being used and set up that you don't see exactly in the West.
One question I have, I came across two things. Basically, the notion that on the Soviet side usually repair was done by replacement. So the planes were basically replaced instead of repaired on the front line, which put a different kind, which reduced the maintenance and logistic units. Do you know how this was done in the West, or do you have a better example on this, how this was performed?
Well, for the Germans specifically, the Germans had this kind of percentage-wise, or percentage-based rather, repair system. So if a plane, it kind of goes into intervals, right? So 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% damage. The 100% means it's completely gone. 80% means it's essentially also completely gone, but you can salvage a few things from it. 60% means substantive repairs has to be sent back to the front lines. Not to the front lines, to the factories. And then sometimes it's even to the point where you can't repair it, but you also salvage the equipment. And then 40%, this is where it gets interesting. So anything below 20%, over 20% is usually something that could be repaired if the local Geschwader had the means, could be repaired at the front lines. 40% means that actually already some substantial damage has happened. And sometimes they're being sent back to the factory or to workshops. Sometimes it could be done at home. And with that, I mean the airfield, the local airfield where the Geschwader is based. However, it's also a question of are spare parts available or not. And one of the big things that some people perhaps don't think about is that an aircraft is useless without an engine and anything that comes with the engine. So if you have, for example, let's go with the Focke-Wulfs, the first Focke-Wulfs that come in the 190A1. This is actually quite interesting because everybody gives the Soviets a kind of criticism that their engines weren't working all that well in the early war. But with the with the Focke-Wulf 190A1, with the BMW 801 that they had, the life expectancy of that engine was 20 minutes when it came out. Not 20 minutes, 20 hours. 20 hours.
I was like a bit concerned here.
Yes. And sometimes it because obviously pilots use and abuse the engines to the max. Sometimes you wouldn't even get 10 hours. So when there is no replacement engine, the plane stays on the ground and you can't do anything. For the Allies, I believe that overall they were a little bit better organized when it came to repairs than the Germans, or in a sense that they could do more on their local airfields than the Germans could. But I'd have to look into exactly how they were managing it. Also because of the distances involved of bringing new planes in and so on. I presume that a lot of the things they did is similar to the Germans in a way that, and maybe even a mix between what the Germans did and the Soviets did, is that new equipment kind of replaced the old equipment, but the old equipment was also salvaged to the point where it could be salvaged. And the Soviet Air Force did that as well. I mean, if you have a plane that cannot fly anymore, but there's still a lot of equipment in it that you can use, absolutely, just rip everything out and push the carcass aside and wait for the new planes to come in.
And one final question: I encountered that the Soviets built up guard units also for the fighter arm, for instance. And is there something similar on the Western Allies side, that they had special elite squadrons for fighter planes or something, or air armies or something? Because we all know about those guard units all the time, and we also know that the Wehrmacht, for instance, had several elite units. But I've actually never encountered something on the Western Allies side that I can remember. Do you know anything about this? Was there a certain difference, or were there some elite units, but they were not explicitly declared as such?
I think it's mainly to do with that they're not explicitly declared, but also that there was a lot of homogeneity. What we have to remember is that for the Germans and for the Soviets, for the Soviets a little bit more than the Germans, but there was no real rotation of pilots. So pilots that fought at the beginning of the war, unless they died, they fought until the end, and they had very few breaks in between. And for the Soviets, this is also true. However, they rotate the squadrons a little bit more than the Germans, and the pilots a little bit more than the Germans. As for the guard units, on paper, yes, they're supposed to be these kind of elite squadrons, And it is true that, for example, some of them got the best equipment, but not all. There are some guard units that actually fly with outdated equipment. It's also true that they sometimes had a little bit more training. On the whole, however, I wouldn't really say that they were elite just because they were guard. There is a certain discrepancy between all these different units, and some of them perform really, really well, and some of these guards units don't perform that well at all. But also that depends on the context that they're being used in. Going back to the Allies again, there are, of course, squadrons that everybody talks about and says, oh, these guys did really, really well. One of the examples that I guess you could give is Tuscany air pilots. Everybody, says, that, oh yeah, they were the best at escorting bombers and so on and so forth. A lot of that is disputable, and I think overall in the West, what the Western Allies did really well is create a homogeneity between their fighter pilots and their fighter wings, so that everybody has a certain standard that they will perform at. Everybody has a certain time frame that they have to fight in, and everybody gets rest when they need it. And that is, I think, the big advantage that the Western Allies have over, for example, the Soviets that do rest their pilots once in a while, and definitely an advantage they had over the Germans.
So in a way, it's similar to how they organized at the front line, that they have a large amount of troops everywhere, in contrast to the Eastern Front again, where you have a focus on mass points of a lot of planes at certain times to supporting offensive or supporting the defense. So basically, the West was more, as you said, homogenic in many ways in comparison to the Eastern Front, where you always have dispersed and concentrations.
Yeah, I mean, in the way when the bombers attack Germany, of course, that's a concentrated attack, right? But this is something that happens on a nearly day basis on different targets, that it is, as you say, kind of dispersed around the area. And in that way, the air war, not just because it happens at a different altitude, which is substantial of a difference, but just because it kind of, sometimes it's here, sometimes it's there, and but at the same time, it's kind of happening everywhere. It's a very different context to what we have on the Eastern Front.
Now, as a final point, we started with terrain, and I think there's also some differences, since you mentioned that in the West that the altitudes were usually higher. So what were the different requirements to have a good or excellent plane on the Western or Eastern Front?
Well, if you want a good requirement for the early war on the Western Front, for what's necessary in the West, you can, for example, look at the Spitfire. Spitfire is a really good defensive aircraft. It climbs really well, gets up to altitude, contests and tangles with the Germans during the Battle of Britain. And that's something that, for example, is kind of the standard of what happens to be a requirement for a defensive fighter throughout the war. Now, the Spitfire isn't really used in a defensive role all that much after the Battle of Britain. Sometimes yes, but mainly no. And you have, on the German side, of course, the Bf-109s and the Focke-Wulf 190s. They have to get to altitude quick in order to be able to attack the bomber formations and later on also the escorts over the Reich. So climbing performance and getting to a high altitude fast is important. And it's really rather complicated. And also when it comes to engine design, of creating a engine that performs well, at all these different altitudes. So what we see with the Western Allies is that usually their engines perform really well, let's say at 4,000 meters or above. 6,000 meters is sometimes a good reference. On the East, completely different. And here the Germans are a little bit of a dilemma, especially once they are on the defensive, is because the Soviets, a lot of their engines are good for low altitude. Once they go above 2,000, 4,000 meter, their engine's performance suffers big time. For the purposes that they have, though, that doesn't really matter because they're doing the attacking, and the Germans, even if they launch tactical strikes, have to go down low. So in a defensive role on the Eastern Front and in an offensive role, low altitude is king. Whereas on the West, of course, because pretty much everything that happens in 1944 and 1945 with a few exceptions, is bomber-based, strategic bomber-based. It's all at high altitude. So that's one of the things that is kind of this crass difference. And for the Germans, they're caught on two sides. On the one hand side, they need an aircraft that is good at low altitude. Some of the Focke-Wulf 190A, A's and the Antons actually relatively good at that role. But they also need something that climbs up very, very fast, very high. The 109s, again, spring to mind. But then, of course, there's a certain problem there because the 109s on the whole, when it comes to offensive armament, and this is another requirement, I guess, suffer a little bit. They have one central mounted cannon, which, yes, you can put a 30 millimeter there once you have the Bf-109 G6, but you really want to have as much firepower as possible. And here, the Focke-Wulfs are, again, better because sometimes they have 2 to 4 20 mils. And yes, of course, you can put gun pods on your aircraft and so on. Pilots usually hated that. They didn't like it. It really makes your aircraft into a dog that you can't maneuver all that well, and so forth. One of the interesting aspects that I think we should close with, however, is that on the Eastern Front, it's really, really peculiar because some designs that are completely outdated from a performance and even from a just a casual observance are completely outdated, perform really well on the Eastern Front. So, for example, the example I would make here is the German Henscher 123. This is a biplane. And this is a biplane the Germans used during the invasion of Poland and also in Spain. And it's kind of their first real Schlachtflugzeug. Yeah? So it's a kind of used in the same role as you would use an IL-2 or a Henscher 129, in the way that it's used directly on the front line against elements that are there. It's not a dive bomber, just like the Ju-87. It holds a relatively smaller bomb load compared to the Ju-87. But even by 1944 and 1945, on the Eastern Front, some commanders ask why the Henscher 123 is not being produced in more substantial numbers. And the problem is that the Germans have already destroyed all their tooling for this aircraft around about 1940, 1941, because they thought the design is completely outdated. But for the Eastern Front, where this very rugged kind of biplane with a relatively, it's a small bomb load, you could say, but it's a relatively good bomb load for what it needs to do. And it can really just attack right where it's needed on the front lines. They don't have that anymore, even though the army and in a way the Luftwaffe is asking, well, maybe we should introduce it again. So this is something that quite humorous in a sense and quite ironic, is that even though some planes are completely outdated from an objective standpoint, when you look at the context that they're being used in, they're actually pretty good, and people are asking for them to be reintroduced.
It's quite interesting considering that on the Pacific theater, also the biplanes, at least as kamikazes, were extremely successful in those few instances they were used. So this is always a quite interesting disparity that's going on between the high tech, the jet, and the biplane in the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that was very interesting. Thank you very much, Bismarck, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So if you want to know more about the Luftwaffe and air warfare, check out Bismarck's channel, Military Aviation History, on YouTube. I can highly recommend it. I worked with him several times and I always enjoyed it. So, and I would say, everyone, thank you for listening and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.